South Korean military has claimed that North Korea has deployed soldiers and heavy weapons at guard posts near the border following the suspension of a military accord between the two nations. Now, this comes amidst warnings from Pyongyang that it would continue to exercise its sovereign rights, including through satellite launches, while allegedly restoring demolished guard posts in several locations along its border with South Korea. North Korea's continued military activities prompted South Korea to snatch the military accord. The launch prompted South Korea to suspend a key clause in a 2018 inter-Korean military agreement and resume aerial surveillance near the border. North Korea, in turn, declared it was no longer bound by the agreement and would deploy weapons on the border with the South. DD News correspondent Chris Gilbert joins us from Tokyo, Japan. Chris, South Korea military has put the soldiers and heavy weapons on standby mode at the guard post. At the same time, get us more details as to how grave is this development, and do we have any international reactions coming on this?
Yeah, well, the international reaction, first of all, has been largely expected. A condemnation from Japan and the United States and South Korea, of course, to the satellite launch. A lack of condemnation coming from China and Russia, which continue to accuse the U.S. of not balancing sanctions with humanitarian assistance for Pyongyang like it had promised to do. But I think, a lot of the behavior that we've seen from North Korea is largely expected. It had vowed all year to launch a satellite. It had provided a window until December that it intended to do so. It did so inside that window, well, only just. It was just immediately before that window opened, in fact. And it is vowing to do so again. It has seemingly got what it wanted, which was extra surveillance, especially of the U.S. military facilities. But what was not really expected was the response from South Korea, which observers are saying is a very grave situation, which was the suspension of an article which had put in place no-fly zones. This was done by the previous administration in South Korea, and it was intended and had in fact de-escalated the peninsula, tensions in the peninsula. So the current administration of South Korea exhibiting that it not only perhaps doesn't intend to pursue talks with North Korea, but is intent on perhaps also actively abandoning agreements that are already in place.
Chris, with North Korea unfazed by the condemnation of US, South Korea, Japan, how do we see the situation developing in the next few days? Is the situation belligerent in the coming few days?
It's been interesting. It's hard to quantify exactly, what the tensions on the peninsula are. It has been a very quiet year so far from North Korea in terms of missile launches. We've seen about half of the projectiles launched that we saw last year. We've seen about half of the impromptu responses from South Korea that we saw last year. We have seen a lot of geopolitical maneuvering with Pyongyang getting closer to Moscow, of course, and South Korea and Tokyo getting closer and improving their relations trilaterally with the U.S. It is a small escalation, but a lot depends on how much the international community accepts North Korea's argument that it is looking to defend itself. We saw an outright rejection of that from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations just in the intro just then. But depending on how much the international community accepts the fact that North Korea says and feels like it has a gun pointed to its head, being told to come back to the bargaining table with U.S. nuclear-armed aircraft carriers often parked in Busan throughout the year. That depends on the international reaction to what is South Korea walking away from part of an agreement to de-escalate the peninsula and any intention from the U.S.-led forces and partners to indeed return to talks and meet North Korea where its interests are as well.
All right, Chris, in the past few weeks, we've seen how Japan, US, and South Korea have come closer in the wake of North Korea's endeavors. Let us understand more from you as to how the two sides poised. Where does this confidence of North Korea stem from? At the same time, when we talk of these three countries, South Korea, Japan, and the US closer, how do you analyze the situation? The positioning of these two sides?
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. The US has long wanted South Korea and Japan to bury their long-running historical hatchets and get together to form the kind of trilateral agreements that we're seeing. And we are seeing a lot of trilateral meetings, especially between the foreign ministers of the US, South Korea, and Japan at the moment. Now, the administration in South Korea of Yoon Suk-yeol, who was elected president only by a very thin margin a year and a half ago, that is far more friendly towards Tokyo. It does not necessarily care about historical grievances that are still felt by the South Korean public as much as the preceding government. And the current administration in Tokyo as well is very prone to wanting to pursue anything that is in the US interests and work with the US. And so we are seeing the expedited burying of a lot of hatchets about labor disputes stemming from the Japanese colonization of the peninsula, about territorial disputes, and that is happening at the executive level. It is not necessarily trickling down to the public sentiment yet. It cannot necessarily be said that the public of these countries is feeling any warming of ties between South Korea and Japan, but it is certainly happening at the executive level, and the US is very interested in securing as many agreements with these two countries as possible while they're getting along, lest the administrations change and they have a change of heart.
All right, Chris, we leave it here. Thank you for joining in with those details.